Bullets tore through the morning sky. Shadows waited where the ridges lie. They thought her fear would seal her fate, but Eve laughed seconds before the hate. Apache engines screamed. She soared. Doubt and mockery she ignored. Underestimated, yet fierce and true, the sky remembered what she could do. Asterisk, if you love thrilling true-to-life stories of courage and resilience, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that inspires, amazes, and keeps you on the edge of your seat. Now, let's dive into the incredible story of Eve Carter, the Apache pilot who laughed seconds before impact. The sun had barely begun its climb over the horizon when Captain Evelyn Eve Carter strode across the tarmac of Fort Bragg's helicopter base. The morning was cold, the kind of chill that crept into bones and refused to leave, but Eve welcomed. It reminded her that she was alive, that she was awake, that she had work to do. Eve's boots clicked against the concrete, echoing in the empty stretch of hangars and parked aircraft. She pulled her jacket tighter, feeling the familiar weight of the flight helmet under her arm. For months now, she had been training, flying, preparing, but not everyone at the base took her seriously. "Hey, Eve?" a voice called from the side. It belonged to Lieutenant Mark Benson, one of the junior pilots. His grin was laced with condescension. "Careful out there. Don't want to get your pretty little helmet scratched." Eve didn't flinch. She had heard the whispers long before she even arrived at Fort Bragg, the doubts, the snickers, the jokes. A woman piloting an Apache was a novelty. Some saw her as a headline, not a threat. But Eve had learned early not to waste energy on people who underestimated her. She smiled politely, masking the irritation that burned inside. "I'll take care of it," she said evenly, adjusting her helmet strap. "See you in the air." As she climbed into the cockpit of a H-64 Apache longbow, the familiar hum of the engines filled her with a strange comfort. She ran through the pre-flight checks methodically, her hands moving almost automatically. Years of training had made precision second nature, and she prided herself on leaving nothing to chance. The base had assigned her a solo reconnaissance mission that morning, a simple sweep over the nearby training zone. But Eve had a feeling it wouldn't be simple. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. She rose smoothly, the Apache's rotors cutting through the crisp morning air, and felt the familiar thrill of freedom. Flying had always been more than a job. For her, it was an affirmation. Out there, above the forests and rivers, no one could dismiss her. She was in control, but even as the base shrank beneath her, Eve knew that appearances could be deceiving. Intelligence reports had hinted at unusual activity along the southern border of the training zone's suspicious vehicles, moving at odd hours. Reports of gunfire that couldn't be traced. Normally, these were dismissed as routine training anomalies. But Eve had learned to trust instincts. Something was off. Her mind shifted briefly to the way the male pilots had treated her in briefings. One had even suggested that the military was too tough for someone like her. The words had stung, not because she doubted her ability, but because she had dedicated her life to proving that she could handle anything, and yet she was still fighting prejudice within her own ranks. Eve sighed softly. It wasn't the first time she had faced skepticism. Growing up in a small Midwestern town, she had been told that flying was boys' work, that she should consider something quieter, safer. But Eve's mother had always encouraged her to reach higher. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do," her mother had said, especially when it's fear talking. Those words had stuck. Now, as she maneuvered her Apache over the dense tree line, Eve felt that same determination rise within her. She wasn't just flying for herself. She was flying for everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or mocked for daring to step beyond expectations. The mission began uneventfully. Eve observed the ground below, noting the positions of training vehicles, the occasional stray deer darting through the underbrush. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows that stretched across the landscape. Then, without warning, the calm shattered. The first sign was a distant crack-sharp, deliberate, unnatural. Eve's heart tightened as she scanned the horizon. Gunfire, and not from the training zone, but from hidden positions along the ridgeline. Someone had set up an ambush. Eve's mind went into overdrive. Years of combat simulations and training kicked in. She banked the Apache sharply, seeking cover behind a ridgeline. Her voice was steady, calm, professional, even as her pulse raced. Control. This is Eagle One. I've got hostile fire at my 12 o'clock, approximately 2 clicks south of the training zone. Request immediate support, she reported. Static. Filled the radio. Backup would take too long. It was up to her. Eve's hands moved over the controls with precision. Missiles armed, targeting systems calibrated. She could see the glint of gunfire reflecting off the metal of the vehicles below. Her first instinct was survival. Get out of there. But she knew retreating would only give the attackers confidence. They had underestimated her, as they always did. That had to end. And then something almost human happened. Despite the danger, a laugh escaped her lips. Not a nervous laugh, not a panicked one, but a full, defiant chuckle that echoed through the cockpit. It was absurd, almost foolish, but in that moment, it was powerful. The laugh was a message, even if no one on the ground could hear it. You think you've caught me off guard? It said, you have no idea who you're dealing with. The attackers, hidden and confident, hadn't accounted for her resilience, her training, or her instinct. Eve's laughter became a weapon of sorts, a spark that fueled her focus. Every movement, every calculation, every decision that followed was sharper, more precise. The Apache shuddered as another burst of gunfire ripped across the ridge. Eve's training told her instantly that these were not random shots. These attackers were coordinated, experienced. Someone had studied this terrain, plotted the angles, and now tried to pin her down. She scanned the ground below through the targeting sensors, noting the positions of hidden vehicles and makeshift barricades. Every second counted. Hesitation meant death. Eagle One, what's your status? A crackling voice came through the radio. Control, I'm engaged. Eve replied, voice calm despite the adrenaline thrumming in her veins. Multiple hostiles, small arms fire, ridge positions confirmed. I'm maneuvering for cover. She banked the Apache sharply to the left, the rotors slicing the air with a fierce rhythm. Dust and leaves swirled beneath her as she dove behind a ridge, using the terrain as protection. She could feel her heart pounding, but it wasn't fear. It was focus. Every ounce of her being was concentrated on staying alive and taking control of the fight. The attackers weren't prepared for her response. They had assumed that their ambush would intimidate her, that their presence alone would shake the confidence of the woman pilot, who had earned a reputation for courage, but still faced whispers of doubt among her peers. They had underestimated the strength that came from years of proving herself, from facing prejudice, from overcoming doubt. Eve's laugh from moments earlier still echoed in her mind, a reminder that fear would not dominate her. She allowed herself a brief, sharp grin. Sometimes, she realized, the simplest act of defiance could be the most disarming. From her vantage point, she could see the layout of the ambush more clearly. 2 jeeps flanked the ridge, armed with mounted weapons. Another vehicle crouched behind. Trees, its gun aimed upward. Eve's fingers danced over the controls, locking onto targets, calculating trajectories, and readying her payload. The first missile fired with a low hum that vibrated through the cockpit. Eve's hands were steady. Her aim was true. The missile struck the jeep on the left, sending a shower of sparks and debris into the air. The attacker's coordinated rhythm faltered. "You think this is a game?" she muttered under her breath, the laughter in her throat now tempered with fury. "You don't even know me." The next wave of attackers opened fire, and Eve dove again, leaving her helicopter like a predator in the sky. The Apache groaned, but she felt no fear, only determination. Every maneuver was calculated to minimize exposure. Every decision a life or death choice. Her mind flashed memories of those who had doubted her. The snide comments in briefings, the laughter of male pilots when she was assigned the most difficult tasks, the small-town whispers that a girl from the Midwest could never handle such responsibility. Every insult, every belittling word had prepared her for this moment. She had learned to convert scorn into fuel, to transform underestimation into tactical advantage. The attackers regrouped quickly, their movements coordinated. Eve realized she had to take a calculated risk. She banked steeply, diving behind a cluster of trees, and then climbing sharply, using the ridge to mask her trajectory. From above, she could see the central vehicle larger, more armored than the others beginning to retreat. She pursued, following her instincts and her training with ruthless precision. Suddenly, the unexpected happened. One of the attackers fired a high-caliber round that struck the Apache's fuselage. Sparks erupted inside the cockpit, and alarms blared. Eve's heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but in recognition of the danger. She was trained for this. She could handle this. "Steady," she whispered to herself, gripping the controls tightly. "You've survived worse." The fire in her eyes was matched only by the fire in her hands. She corrected the trajectory, firing another missile that hit the armored vehicle squarely, sending it skidding across the forest floor. The attackers were faltering, disorganized, no longer coordinated. Eve's laughter broke free again, louder this time, a bold, defiant sound that reverberated in the empty cockpit. Below, the surviving assailants froze, unsure whether the pilot was mocking them or insane. Eve didn't care. She had learned long ago that power often came from confidence, from the audacity to claim victory before it was certain. Then the unthinkable, a second ambush, hidden even better than the first, opened fire from the far ridge. Eve's body tensed, every nerve alert. This was no longer about pride or proving herself. This was survival, but she didn't panic. She never did. She had survived harsh winters alone on training exercises. She had flown through storms that rattled even the most seasoned pilots, and she had faced more doubt than she could count. Eve had become something stronger than fear. She had become focused, precise, and unbreakable. "Not today," she muttered, pulling a sharp maneuver. The Apache twisted in the sky, dodging rounds that would have shredded any ordinary pilot. Her mind ran faster than the rotors, calculating angles, trajectories, and timing with machine-like precision. Her laughter, absurd and defiant, continued, a symbol of resistance and courage. It was impossible to predict, impossible to counter. The attackers hesitated, giving Eve the opening she needed. She struck again, this time disabling 2 more vehicles with pinpoint accuracy. And then, finally, silence. The ridges below were empty, the ambush broken, the attackers fleeing into the forest, their confidence shattered. Eve hovered for a moment, her chest heaving, the adrenaline still coursing through her. She allowed herself a small smile. She had survived, yes, but more than that she had proven, once again, that underestimation was a dangerous mistake. Those who doubted her had done so, not because of her ability, but because they could not see strength beyond their own narrow assumptions. Eve radioed control. Eagle One standing down. Ambush neutralized. Request extraction and status check. Static, then the voice of a superior. Copy that, Eagle One. Outstanding work. You're cleared to return to base. As she turned the Apache back toward Fort Bragg, Eve allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. The fight was over for now, but the lessons remained. She had faced prejudice, danger, and doubt, and had emerged not only alive, but victorious. And in that moment, high above the earth, the laughter that had carried her through the chaos lingered, a reminder that courage was not just strength, but joy in defiance, a light that refused to be extinguished. The Apache's rotors cut through the air in a steady rhythm as Eve guided it back toward Fort Bragg. The sun had climbed higher now, warming the tarmac that had felt so cold that morning. But no matter how bright the day, Eve felt a lingering chill in her chest, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and something more subtle, frustration. Arriving at the base, she executed a textbook landing, the Apache touching down with precision that earned a nod from a nearby ground crew. Sweat clung to her forehead, her uniform was flecked with dust, and yet she moved with calm efficiency. Eve's training was meticulous, and she refused to let exhaustion or emotion compromise her performance. As the crew secured the helicopter, whispers began to circulate. The male pilots who had doubted her, who had smirked when she first joined the unit, now looked uneasy. Some avoided her gaze. Others fidgeted, trying to appear casual, while stealing glances at the pilot who had just survived a near-impossible ambush. Eve ignored them. She had learned that respect often lagged behind accomplishment, that those who underestimated her were slow to recognize talent unless it was undeniable. She moved through the hangar with her usual purposeful stride, heading toward the debriefing room. Inside, the room smelled of coffee and cold metal. Commanders and officers were already gathered, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Eve could feel the weight of their expectations, the unspoken question lingering in the air. Could she tell the story without faltering? Could she justify her decisions without seeming reckless? Colonel Harris, a stern man whose reputation for fairness was only matched by his skepticism of women in combat, looked up as she entered. His eyes narrowed not in anger, but in assessment. "Captain Carter," he said, voice measured, "report." Eve's voice was calm, steady, unwavering. She recounted the ambush in detail, the positions of the attackers, their tactics, the risks, and her strategic response. She described every maneuver, every decision, every moment when instinct and training had guided her hand. As she spoke, she noticed the subtle shifts in the room. Officers who had doubted her now leaned forward, listening intently. Even Colonel Harris's expression softened, though he maintained a professional composure. When she finished, silence hung in the room for a beat too long. Then a junior officer, still visibly uneasy, muttered, You went above and beyond, Captain." Eve allowed herself the tiniest smile. "I did what was necessary," she said simply. "Underestimating me was a mistake. I hope it's not repeated." The room remained quiet for a moment. Then Colonel Harris finally spoke. "Indeed, excellent work. Your actions today saved lives and preserved equipment that would have been lost." His tone held respect, though it was delivered without flourish. "I trust the rest of the unit will take note." Despite the praise, Eve felt the familiar sting of frustration. Recognition, yes, but trust and equal treatment were still fragile, still conditional. She knew that today's success would be discussed in hushed tones, that some would chalk it up to luck or circumstance rather than skill and courage. In the privacy of her quarters, Eve allowed herself a moment to release the tension. She sank into a chair, letting the events of the day wash over her. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion and reflection in its wake. She thought about the attackers, who they were, why they had chosen this location, why they had thought. She could be caught off guard. And she thought about her peers, the whispers, the condescension she had endured. Every insult, every moment of doubt, every laugh aimed at her ambition had built this armor she now wore, one forged in patience, skill, and unyielding determination. Thoughts drifted to home, to the small town where she had grown up. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do, especially when it's fear talking. It had been a lesson she carried with her through every training exercise, every mission, every skeptical glance. It had shaped her into a pilot who could face death and mock it with a laugh before it touched her. But even as she reflected on her strength, Eve felt the weight of solitude. Her resilience came at a cost. Friendships were harder to maintain when everyone else assumed you are untouchable, untiring. Emotional walls that protected her in the air also isolated her on the ground. She missed connection, the simple assurance that someone saw her as more than a pilot or a symbol. The next day, the base held a formal debrief. Eve entered the room again, facing officers and peers who now regarded her with cautious respect. Yet, whispers lingered. Some doubted the full story, assuming she had exaggerated or relied on luck. Others saw her as a threat to the traditional hierarchy, a disruption to a system that had long been male-dominated. One officer, Lieutenant Marshall, dared to challenge her. Captain Carter, we've reviewed the footage. Some say your maneuvers were reckless. Others claim you relied on chance more than strategy. Can you explain? Eve met his gaze steadily, her voice unwavering. The footage doesn't capture instinct, experience, or the split-second decisions that save lives. I made calculated choices based on every ounce of training I've received. Risk is inherent in this work. Luck is not what carried me through. It's preparation, skill, and resolve. There was a pause. She could feel the tension in the room, the weight of skepticism pressing against her. Then Colonel Harris spoke again, cutting through the murmurs. She's right, he said. Captain Carter's decisions were deliberate, precise, and courageous. Anyone who dismisses this as luck is ignoring reality. Despite the support, Eve sensed an undercurrent of resentment. Not everyone was ready to accept that a woman had outperformed expectations in such a high-stakes scenario. She would need to continue proving herself, not for recognition, but for justice, for fairness, for the simple truth that ability is not defined by gender. In the following weeks, Eve returned to training, pushing herself harder than ever. She spent hours in simulations, refining her skills, reviewing every move from the ambush, ensuring that no moment of hesitation could ever repeat itself. But her focus wasn't just on the battlefield. It was also on earning trust, building alliances, and navigating the subtle politics of the base. During this period, she also formed unexpected connections. A small group of fellow pilots, initially wary of her abilities, began to see her not just as a skilled pilot, but as a leader and a strategist. They sought her advice, shared insights, and even began training alongside her. Slowly, the isolation she had felt began to ease. She realized that respect and friendship could grow even in an environment built on hierarchy and tradition, when courage was consistent and authentic. Yet, Eve never forgot the ambush or the hidden threats that had confronted her. Intelligence. Reports hinted that the attackers were not random criminals, but part of a larger, more organized network. Her instincts told her that the challenge was far from over, and she knew that being underestimated had once saved her life, because her adversaries never expected her to react with such boldness. Eve also began keeping a personal journal, documenting every detail of her experiences, the ambush, the strategies, the lessons learned. It was her way of processing the stress, reflecting on her choices, and preparing for whatever came next. In those quiet moments, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to acknowledge fear, frustration, and anger not as weaknesses, but as fuel for growth. As weeks turned into months, Eve's reputation solidified. Stories of her bravery circulated among the base and beyond. Some dismissed them as exaggeration. Others celebrated them quietly, inspired by her unwavering courage. And though whispers of doubt never fully disappeared, Eve had learned that actions spoke louder than words. She had survived the ambush. She had faced prejudice, danger, and doubt, and emerged stronger. But the path ahead was clear. She would not only defend herself in the sky, she would continue to challenge assumptions, confront injustice, and demand the recognition that her skill and courage deserved. And somewhere deep inside, she felt a quiet anticipation, a sense that the true test of strategy, resilience, and justice was still to come. Fort Bragg hummed with its usual activity, but to Eve, something felt different. The base, normally a place of discipline and predictable order, now seemed layered with whispers and hidden currents. The ambush had shifted her life in subtle ways. Respect had grown, but so had scrutiny. Every move she made was being watched, analyzed, and sometimes doubted, as if her survival alone was not enough to earn unquestioned trust. It started with a briefing. Eve entered the conference room, noting the unfamiliar tension. Officers shuffled papers nervously, and glances were exchanged too quickly to be casual. Colonel Harris was there, as always, but his expression seemed clouded, almost uneasy. New face joined the gathering. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, recently transferred from another base, known for a reputation of strict discipline and suspicion toward anyone who disrupted the hierarchy. Captain Carter, Reynolds said, eyes sharp as a blade, "We have reviewed your actions during the ambush. Impressive, certainly. But some inconsistencies in your report require clarification." Eve's chest tightened, not from fear, but from irritation. The implication was clear. Her competence was being questioned. Her account of the ambush scrutinized in minute detail, almost as if success alone could be suspect. "I documented everything," she said evenly. "All decisions, maneuvers, and outcomes were recorded in real time. I am prepared to review it again." Reynolds' gaze did not waver. "We will. Accuracy is critical, Captain. Lives depend on it. There have been anomalies in intelligence about the attackers, and we need complete transparency." Eve's hands tightened on the edges of the briefing table. She understood the subtext. Her ability was threatening the comfortable order, challenging assumptions, and now she was under quiet investigation. But Eve had faced doubt before, and she would not flinch now. "Understood," she replied, voice calm but firm. "I'll provide full clarity." After the briefing, Eve retreated to her quarters, a sense of unease settling over her. She had survived an ambush that would have crippled lesser pilots. She had outmaneuvered trained attackers, preserved lives, and demonstrated unyielding courage. And yet, scrutiny followed her like a shadow. She walked past the Apache, inspecting every panel and rotor, running through checks that had become ritualistic, almost meditative. Each piece of equipment was a reminder that she could rely on her skill, her training, and her instincts. But the human element, the politics, the prejudice, the whispers of doubt, was far more unpredictable. That evening, as the sun set over the base, Eve received an unexpected message, a request to meet with the intelligence team. It was unusual. Normally, she interfaced only with her commanding officers. The note was brief, almost cryptic. "We need your insight. There are developments regarding the ambush. Your expertise is crucial." Curiosity piqued, Eve entered the intelligence briefing room. The team was smaller than usual, their demeanor cautious. Screens lined the walls, displaying satellite imagery, vehicle movements, and intercepted communications. A young analyst spoke first. "Captain Carter, we believe the ambush wasn't random. Evidence suggests coordination by a group with resources and military knowledge. They studied the terrain, the patterns of our training exercises, and they targeted you specifically." Eve's brow furrowed. "Targeted me? Why?" "Because you're a threat to their assumptions," another analyst replied quietly. "Your actions during the ambush, your skill, this challenges the way they've operated. They underestimated you, and that mistake will not be repeated if they can prevent it." Eve's mind raced. This wasn't just an isolated incident. Someone had gone to great lengths to test her, to strike her down, to see if the rumors about the woman pilot were true. It was personal. Over the next days, tension escalated. Eve's movements were monitored more closely. Reynolds continued his pointed questions. His scrutiny thinly veiled his protocol. Even some of her peers, once tentative allies, seemed reluctant to engage, fearful of entanglement in what was becoming a larger, shadowy web of intrigue. Yet Eve refused to yield. She doubled her efforts in training, using simulations to anticipate the next potential ambush, honing every maneuver to perfection. She also began discreet investigations of her own, combing through records, noticing inconsistencies in reports, and quietly piecing together evidence that suggested some within the base might be involved, or at least aware of the attacks. Isolation was heavy. Late nights in the hangar, surrounded by the hum of idle helicopters, brought clarity but also loneliness. Eve spoke little, laughed rarely, and let her work speak for her. But every so often, she allowed herself a fleeting memory. The ridicule from the early days, the whispers from skeptical colleagues, the sense that she would never truly be seen unless she proved herself over and over again. One evening, as she reviewed flight logs, an unexpected ally appeared, Lieutenant Marcy Nguyen, a fellow pilot who had once been cautious around Eve. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Marcy said, her tone gentle but firm. "You've survived the ambush, Captain. You've earned respect. But you can't carry this alone." Eve looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "I can't trust anyone completely," she admitted. "Too many have reasons to doubt, or worse, hide the truth." Marcy nodded. "Then let me help. We can dig deeper together. The people behind this, they'll underestimate us if we stay silent and watch. But they'll regret it if we act." Eve's chest tightened, a mixture of relief and determination. She had long known the value of allies, but trust was a currency she spent sparingly. Yet here was someone willing to stand with her, willing to face the shadows that threatened the base. Together, they began the painstaking work of tracking movements, analyzing communications, and following leads. Slowly, a pattern emerged, a network that extended beyond the base, with connections that suggested betrayal, miscommunication, and deliberate manipulation. Eve felt the weight of the discovery keenly. This was more than professional vindication. This was about justice, about exposing the truth, about proving that courage and skill were not enough. If deception thrived behind the ranks, and then came the first hint of a breakthrough, a hidden report, buried in layers of official files, revealing that certain orders had been altered deliberately, misdirecting support during the ambush, leaving Eve exposed. The realization hit her like a cold wind. She had survived, yes, but someone had tried to ensure her death through manipulation from within. Eve's laugh, quiet at first, escaped her lips in the solitude of the hangar. Not a sound of amusement, but a release of tension and defiance. Those who underestimated her, who tried to harm her through cunning rather than courage, they had set the stage for their own exposure. For the first time, Eve allowed herself to envision not just survival, but justice. Not just respect, but accountability. She had been underestimated once, and now the tables were beginning to turn. The night stretched on, filled with plans, strategy, and careful deliberation. Eve knew that confronting the hidden enemy would require more than courage. It would require precision, patience, and the willingness to risk everything. But she also knew she was ready. She had faced ridicule, ambush, and isolation. She had laughed in the face of danger. And she had allies she could trust. The shadows were no longer abstract. They were defined, traceable, and vulnerable. And Eve was poised to bring them into the light. The early morning sky over Fort Bragg was a pale canvas of blue, streaked with the gold and pink of dawn. Eve stood on the tarmac, staring at the Apache that had become an extension of herself. Today was different. Today, the shadows that had haunted the base, manipulated events, and sought to diminish her were about to face the light. Marcy stood beside her, adjusting her flight helmet. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked. Eve's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "I've been ready for months," she said quietly. "Every movement, every decision, it's all led to this. Today isn't just about surviving. It's about exposing the truth." The intelligence team had worked tirelessly, cross-referencing communications, flight logs, and operational orders. The evidence was undeniable. A small faction within the base had deliberately altered support orders, leaving Eve exposed during the ambush. Their goal had been subtle test her, humiliate her, and if possible, remove her from command. But Eve and Marcy now held the knowledge that would turn the tables as they climbed into the Apache. Eve ran through her pre-flight checks with meticulous care. Every switch, every gauge, every system check became a ritual of focus. Her hands moved with confidence, her mind sharp, the adrenaline calm and steady. The mission itself was risky. They would fly over areas monitored by the faction responsible, gathering direct evidence while preparing to counter any interference. Timing would be crucial. Eve had anticipated multiple scenarios and rehearsed each in her mind, calculating contingencies with precision. The rotors spun to life, and the Apache lifted into the morning air. The base receded below them, the familiar landscape now a battlefield of secrets and deceit. Eve's pulse was steady, but beneath it ran the quiet thrill of anticipation. She was no longer a target. She was the agent of reckoning. Their flight took them along the ridge where the original ambush had occurred. Eve's eyes scanned every shadow, every outcropping of trees. Hidden cameras, unauthorized personnel movements, irregular signals, everything that had eluded casual observation now became part of the story she would expose. "Eyes on that vehicle," Marcy said, pointing to a small transport moving along. A hidden route. Eve adjusted the sensors, confirming what she had suspected. It was one of the operatives who had sabotaged the ambush. "Ready?" Eve asked. Marcy nodded. "Whenever you are." With precise coordination, they maneuvered the Apache to follow the target without being detected. Every decision was calculated: altitude, speed, angle of approach. Eve's mind was a machine of strategy and intuition, blending training with instinct. Then came the crucial moment. Eve released a microdrone from the Apache, sending it into the forest below. The drone's camera captured conversations, documents, and the unmistakable evidence of intentional sabotage. Orders altered, communications hidden, and coordinated planning to endanger her life. Eve allowed herself a quiet smile. This was proof. Not rumor, not speculation. Cold, undeniable evidence. Returning to base, she coordinated with Colonel Harris and the intelligence team. The confrontation would be strategic, public within the chain of command, and undeniable. She could feel the weight of anticipation building. This was the culmination of months of tension, doubt, and silent struggle. In the conference room, the faction responsible was gathered, their confidence slowly evaporating as Eve and Marcy laid out the evidence. Reynolds, whose suspicion had driven him to question her, now looked uneasy, forced to witness the meticulous documentation of truth. Captain Carter, Colonel Harris said, voice steady but firm, "Your evidence is compelling. It leaves no room for interpretation." Eve's eyes swept the room, locking with those who had sought to undermine her. She felt no malice, only the quiet, controlled authority of someone who had endured injustice and now commanded the facts. "You attempted to manipulate operations and endanger lives," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "Your actions were deliberate. You underestimated me, believing skill could be overshadowed by deception. You were wrong." There was silence, a tension that filled the room like static. The individuals responsible avoided her gaze, but Eve held her eyes steady. She had survived ambush, insult, and doubt, and now justice was hers to assert. "Colonel." Harris finally spoke, his voice echoing with authority. "Appropriate measures will be taken. This base cannot tolerate such betrayal. Captain Carter, your integrity and courage have preserved lives and revealed truths that might have otherwise remained hidden." Eve allowed herself a small nod, a mix of satisfaction and release. The long months of struggle, the ridicule, the ambush, the isolation had culminated not just in survival, but in vindication. She had faced adversity at every turn and emerged not just unbroken, but triumphant. Later, as the sun set over the base, Eve and Marcy stood on the tarmac, watching the Apache resting quietly after the day's work. "You did it," Marcy said softly. Eve allowed herself a rare laugh, light and unrestrained. "We did it," she corrected. This wasn't just about survival. It was about integrity, strategy, and refusing to be underestimated. Marcy smiled. "And now the rest of the base will have to acknowledge it." Eve's gaze returned to the horizon, the fading light casting long shadows across the tarmac. She felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Respect had been earned. Justice had been served. And through it all, she had stayed true to herself, courageous, precise, and unyielding. For the first time in months, Eve allowed herself to imagine the future, not just missions and training, but recognition of skill, leadership, and the quiet power of perseverance. She had faced the ambush, the prejudice, and the hidden threats, and she had emerged victorious. And in the quiet of the base, as the Apache hummed softly, and the world seemed to hold its breath, Eve knew that she had not only survived. She had conquered, not through force alone, but through courage, intelligence, and the refusal to be diminished by the doubts of others. Her journey was far from over, but in this moment, she had achieved what she had long sought: respect earned, truth revealed, and the knowledge that even when underestimated, one could rise and laugh before impact. The morning sun bathed Fort Bragg in gold, and the base was alive with activity. Eve moved through the hangar with calm assurance, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. After months of facing doubt, deception, and danger, she had finally reached a place where her voice, skill, and courage could not be ignored. The aftermath of the exposed conspiracy had reverberated through the base. Several officers had been removed or disciplined, and the intelligence team worked tirelessly to ensure no further breaches could occur. Eve's name was quietly circulated among higher command as a model of competence, bravery, and integrity. She had earned the respect of her peers, not through words or protest, but through action, persistence, and unwavering professionalism. Yet for Eve, recognition was secondary. She valued truth and justice, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had survived every challenge while remaining true to herself. The ambush, the ridicule, the isolation, they had forged a strength that was now unshakable. As she prepared the Apache for a routine flight, Marcy joined her. "You okay?" she asked. Eve smiled, adjusting her helmet strap. Better than okay. Ready. Their flight took them over familiar terrain, the ridges, forests, and rivers where Eve had first faced the ambush. The Apache glided smoothly, rotors cutting clean lines through the crisp morning air. It was a reminder that life, like flying, required focus, skill, and courage. During a break in the flight, Eve reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about the early days when colleagues had laughed at her, dismissed her, and underestimated her. She thought about the ambush and the hidden network of betrayal that had tried to take her down. And she thought about the quiet allies who had believed in her when others would not. Her thoughts turned to her mother, to the words that had carried her through every challenge. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do. Those words had guided her through fear, ridicule, and danger, and they had brought her to this moment, a moment of triumph, not just in action, but in spirit. Upon landing, Eve was met by Colonel Harris and the intelligence team. The air was charged with a sense of closure and respect. Captain Carter, the colonel said, you've not only survived, but transformed an impossible situation into one of clarity and justice. The base owes you a debt, not just for your bravery, but for your unwavering integrity. Eve nodded, a quiet smile on her lips. She had no need for grand applause. Her satisfaction was deeper than recognition. She had proven herself, upheld the truth, and ensured the safety of those around her. Later, in the mess hall, Eve found herself surrounded by colleagues who had once doubted her. The atmosphere had shifted. Whispers of admiration replaced the skepticism that had lingered for so long. Lieutenant Benson, who had mocked her at the beginning, approached quietly. Captain Carter, I owe you an apology, he said, voice sincere. I didn't believe you could handle it. I was wrong. Eve regarded him calmly, her voice steady. It's not about being believed. It's about doing what's right and standing by it. As she turned away, another officer called out, We could learn a lot from you, Carter. This time, it wasn't condescension or doubt, but respect. She allowed herself a small laugh. The sound light, unburdened and free, a far cry from the show. Tense laughter that had carried her through the ambush. In the following days, Eve's role evolved. She was given leadership of a specialized training unit, tasked with preparing pilots for high-risk scenarios. She trained not just for combat, but for resilience, integrity, and strategy, the lessons she had learned through fire, betrayal, and triumph. Her influence spread quietly but powerfully, reshaping the culture of the base. It wasn't just professional victories that marked her journey. Eve had gained something even more precious: confidence in herself, trust in her instincts, and the knowledge that courage paired with integrity could overcome even the darkest intentions. The final twist came quietly, a validation of everything she had endured. One morning, as she reviewed flight logs, she received an anonymous message, not from the base, but from outside intelligence. Your actions have not gone unnoticed. The ambush, your defiance, and the exposure of the conspiracy, these have saved lives and revealed truths beyond Fort Bragg. The system owes you acknowledgement, Captain Carter. Eve allowed herself a rare, full laugh, echoing across the quiet hangar. It was the same laughter that had defied bullets and deceit, but now it was different, unburdened, victorious, and free. She had faced ridicule, danger, and betrayal. She had been underestimated, mocked, and isolated. Yet she had not only survived, she had triumphed. Respect was no longer optional. It had been earned. Justice was no longer delayed. It had been revealed. And Eve Carter, the Apache pilot who laughed seconds before impact, had become a symbol of courage, resilience, and unwavering integrity. As the sun rose higher, casting warm light over the base, Eve climbed into her Apache one last time that morning. She lifted off smoothly, the rotors slicing through the air with a familiar rhythm. Below, Fort Bragg spread out like a world she had conquered, not through force alone, but through focus, strategy, and heart dot. And for the first time, she allowed herself to feel completely at peace. She had faced the impossible and emerged stronger, wiser, and victorious. The laughter that had once been a shield against fear was now a celebration of triumph, a reminder that courage, skill, and integrity could turn the tide, even against the odds. Eve soared into the sky, the world opening before her. The ambush, the shadows, and the doubts were behind her. Ahead was a future she had earned, one she would shape with every decision, every flight, and every moment of unwavering courage. She laughed softly again, not at fear, not at defiance, but at life itself. And this time, the laughter was hers alone, free, victorious, and unforgettable.